Austin's asking about attendance. I'm kind of taking it from here, but in all honesty, given our circumstances, I'm not taking attendance very seriously. So just be here when you can. You'll be able to catch up because all of these videos of these Zoom sessions are going on to D2L. So if you have to miss a class, you'll be able to kind of go in and sit in on it later. What I wanted to do today, are you guys seeing me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm seeing you fine, yeah.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
I am going to mute everybody for the time being. Okay. Let me just read through some of the notes we had from, we're going to finish up with Citizen Kane before we move on. Let me just read some of the notes we had from last time. Nate had mentioned that in the attempted suicide scene, we were talking about lighting last time. Nate had mentioned that in the attempted suicide scene, which is also another great example of deep focus. I'm looking for it right now. Susan was completely in shadow. Bear with me, I know it's here somewhere. He said, with great conviction. Well, actually, I don't see it, but most of you will hopefully just recall. That's another example of deep focus because we have Susan sort of obscured in the foreground, and the largest thing in the foreground, the most important thing in the foreground, being the sort of glass that suggests she has taken something. Way deep in the background, we can, again, in focus, we can see and hear. Sound is very important here too. Kane and someone else trying to break in the door. She is completely in shadow in the foreground, which is, you know, is certainly kind of a foreteller of death or illness. You know, there's something wrong with her because of that. So that's a good point. Dylan had there was a sort of conversation going on about in the comments about rosebud and what rosebud means. I think I'll open that up in just a second. Let's just see what people have already said. Let me share the screen here real quick so you guys can see this. Dylan Hughes has said it just reflects reckless ambition. I'm not sure if Dylan was talking about Rosebud or not. Ethan, this seems like an obvious question, but was there any real importance to Rosebud? It certainly gives a reason. Oh, I think the reckless ambition was a reference to the Declaration of Principles. This seems like an obvious question, but was there any real importance to Rosebud? It certainly gives a reason for the reporters to give us the story, but in the end, did it really have any meaning? Jack came in and said, I think the sled represents lost youth and innocence. Lauren came in and said, I feel like they wanted to make the focus more on the context of the scene rather than what is going on in the scene, like the why. I'm trying to remember what we were talking about there. Also, whenever they never clearly show his face, this is going back to Wells's character, Charles Foster Kane, being in shadow. Whenever they nearly show his face, could be because the focus of the storyline is trying to focus more on the story of Kane's life, I guess, rather than Kane himself. This creates a sense of mystery in the film since the whole film is about finding out the meaning of Rosebud. Braden, I would agree that Rosebud is a symbol for the loss of innocence. Also, the deep focus also added emotional impact in the scenes in Xanadu and the Susan Alexander with her in the foreground and Kane far in the background. The distant connotates the emotional distance between the two characters. By the way, I'm also putting these chats, the texts of the chats in the in D2L2, so all of this stuff is there. Let me throw it right out to you guys, and maybe somebody can just pop up in the chat and tell me who would like to comment or on Rosebud. Let's talk about Rosebud just for a few minutes. Who would like to comment on Rosebud? Okay, so Braden, let me find you. All right, Braden, I should be able to hear you now. Oh, wait, I think I just unmuted the wrong person. Hold on. This thing pops around on me a little bit here. Braden, where are you? Here you are. All right, Braden, we should be able to hear you. Can you try?
Yeah.
Hey, okay, good. All right.
So,
What do you have to say about Rosebud?
yeah, I've kind of been, stuck in my apartment like Susan Alexander, like trying to do the jigsaw puzzle of Kane, because it's kind of been stuck in my head from something you said and another student said about, and I want to tie us back to the Declaration of Principles.
Okay.
And he said that, Kane kind of just immediately goes against that. And you were talking about how, well, you felt like that he meant it. That that the student brought up interesting points. And I kind of agreed with both of you because, it goes back to what I was saying last time about that duality of his character, that he is two people. And he says it to Thatcher in Thatcher's manuscript that, why am I going, I'm a shareholder in the public transit. And he's like, yes, but I'm two people. I'm the shareholder, but I'm also the inquirer, and this is my passion, and I'm going to stand up for these people. And so I think that you both are right, that there's the intention. It starts off good, that he is there and that he's biting the hand that feeds him, and that he's going to he's going to use his privilege against the people that are giving him that privilege, and he's going to stand up against these guys. And so Rosebud, I think, is very interesting, and it fits into that kind of duality, in that it's not just that he's holding on, as someone said, his resentment of being torn away from home. It's that Rosebud is a part of his self-mythology. The thing that I think stops him from becoming that,
nice.
It stops him from becoming that working class hero, the hero of the people, is that he can't marry these two identities. He can't bring them together. Like he sees himself as the victim. Like he's holding on to Rosebud. Like, I am that little boy in Colorado that was ripped from his home. I'm not like Mr. Thatcher. I'm not this rich, privileged guy. He's holding on to that, and that's a part of his big identity of why he can't bring these two people. The man that he's become, this man of privilege and wealth and entitlement. He can't fully see that because he still sees himself very much as that little boy who is unrightfully wronged by money and contracts. And I thought more about that stunning scene with the light coming down on this like holy manuscript. And then I realized someone was talking about the manuscript, and I realized that the fact that it's a manuscript makes it so much far more suspect of something that we can trust, right? Like, who doesn't lie in a memoir? Like writing is hard enough in a journal to be truthful to yourself, let alone writing that about yourself that other people will read.
Right.
And then
no, go ahead. Keep going.
Sorry. The last thing
you're on a roll.
Like,
go.
That scene, because again, it's like Susan Alexander over here. That scene bothered me. It was odd, that scene where we go into his childhood, which we only see from the manuscript's perspective, and it was just that the way the family acts doesn't make sense to me. Right? It's like I get that. Okay, the wife has the power because she has the deed to the Colorado lode, but how is it that she seems to have so much power in that situation? She's in the foreground, and she kind of just shuts down her husband's protest. But then when we go outside to talk to little Charles, it's like, well, the husband is the abusive one, and that's why she has to get him out. She has to get him out of here because he's the abusive one. But yet he seems so weak-willed the entire time, and she seems so strong. But yet then she's doing it because she cares about him, but she seems so cold and emotionally distant. Like, she doesn't seem to care that that he may overhear about how they're basically kind of just like selling him off. And she opens up the window when he shuts it. She's like, no, let him hear. And she's like, I packed his bag weeks ago. So, and the only thing I can think is that scene is told from Thatcher's perspective, so it paints him in the best light possible. And it's like he's coming in to do this sort of Orphan Annie scenario, and he's giving this kid this great life, and he's just ungrateful, and the mother's cold and emotionally distant, and the dad's abusive, So that's all I would say about Rosebud, is that, there's this duality in him trying to see himself as, I'm the victim, and I'm that little boy in Colorado. I'm not Mr. Thatcher, so that way he can't really see his own privilege in that. So that's what I would say.
I have so much to respond, and I'm going to try to remember all of it. I've been taking notes. you talk about the idea of the manuscript perhaps being suspect, and we've talked all the way back to Singing in the Rain about unreliable narrators, about when we are shown something, it becomes more real to us in a film than when we are just told something. One of the things I think that's so important here, since you have a movie that is from different people's perspective, we are hearing the story has been written out to us by Thatcher. And you're absolutely right in a very premeditated way, right? This is something he has worked on. This is something he has toiled over. It's not just the immediate kind of, I'm going to tell you my memories that we have with every other character, but we're still seeing him from each of those characters. And the one thing we do not have access to, except for one tiny brief moment, is Kane himself. What does Kane think? What does Kane remember? What does Kane say? We don't get that. And no one in the movie ever gets it. Thompson never gets it. None of Kane's friends ever get it. We, in fact, as the viewers, are the only ones that get the tiny little piece of it. And the tiny little piece of it is that sled that's on fire in that furnace that we see in the last moments of its existence that no one will ever see again and no one but us will ever know about. In the world of Citizen Kane, no one will ever know what Rosebud is. It's gone. And we have a certain privilege that no one in the movie has. And sometimes you do refer to this as narrative privilege. What do we as a viewer or a reader or a consumer know as opposed to what do characters know? And this is an example of privilege that we have that is completely separate from anything the rest of the characters will know. So it becomes not only the duality of Charles Foster Kane, it also becomes the unknowingness of Charles Foster Kane. We're outside that no trespassing sign, right? We get to go in briefly. We get to kind of see him objectively. We get to see him die. We get to see him say the word. We know all that stuff happens. That's completely objective. And we have this one moment at the end where we get this insight to him that no one else will ever have. I honestly believe that to me is the strength of Rosebud. The strength of Rosebud is it is not necessarily its meaning. I think there's importance there, but it's that we know it and no one else ever will. We have this piece of information that no one else will ever have. In terms of the other thing I wanted to say, in terms of your very interesting, complicated description of the family dynamic, which is complicated, right? And it is left purposely, I think, ambiguous. When we get forward and we start talking about John Ford, maybe in just a little while today, there's a quote, and I'm not going to remember his name. It's another filmmaker. It'll come to me later. But the quote that he says in talking about John Ford, the director, is ambiguity is the artist's friend, something like that, right? We've talked about melodrama in this class, and there's certainly certain melodramatic elements of Citizen Kane. Rosebud might even be one of them. But what you don't get in melodrama is the complication of a scene in which characters act contradictory but still seem real and still seem true to themselves, in which the storyline is not just given to us, but we have to interpret and we have to kind of bring our own interpretation onto it. Is the father abusive? Does she want to hand Charles Foster Kane over to Thatcher because she's worried that her husband will abuse him? Is it really that she's just she just doesn't want to deal with it? She's obviously a very cold woman, at least on the surface. There are lots of different ways to get into that scene, and the movie refuses to give us a clear answer on exactly what that is all about, on this little piece of this memory from long ago about this person that we don't get to really meet. So there's a lot. One of the things I want to do real quick is I want to give you an idea of what Orson Welles, over the course of his career, had to say about Rosebud. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint now? Nod heads?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a long quote from Orson Welles in 1941 when he was making the movie, right? The most basic of ideas was that of a search for the true significance of the man's apparently meaningless dying words. Kane was raised without a family. He was snatched from his mother's arms in early childhood. His parents were a bank. From the point of view of a psychologist, my character had never made what is known as transference from his mother, hence his failure with his wives. In making this clear during the course of the picture, it was my attempt to lead the thoughts of my audience closer and closer to the solution of the enigma of his dying words. These were Rosebud. The device of the picture calls for a newspaperman who didn't know Kane to interview people who knew him very well. None had ever heard of Rosebud. Actually, as it turns out, Rosebud is the trade name of a cheap little sled on which Kane was playing on the day he was taken away from his home and his mother. In his subconscious, it represented the simplicity, the comfort, above all, the lack of responsibility in his home. And also, it stood for his mother's love, which Kane never lost. This is Orson Welles right in the height of the release of the movie. This is Orson Welles as a 25-year-old artist. This is Orson Welles as Darren Aronofsky, who is more than happy to sort of explain what his movie is all about, what Mother is all about. Orson Welles as David Lynch, who doesn't want to tell you what his movie's about, is Orson Welles more in 1963 when he said about Rosebud, it's a gimmick, really, just rather dollar book Freud, meaning cheap psychology. This is obviously a drastic sort of shift over the years of an artist's sort of appraisal of his own work and taking this device very seriously in the heat of the moment as a young artist and trying in his later years to basically dismiss it. And I don't necessarily have anything terribly to say about that, but I do find it interesting. Let me make sure that I may be losing some stuff in the chat room here. Let me see. Max is saying, one thing I find interesting about Rosebud is that no one is around to hear him say it. His nurse might have heard it, but considering that he whispers Rosebud and the nurse was a good distance away and in fact wasn't even in the room yet, that wouldn't make sense. Max, I'm going to let me mute everyone. All right, and then let me find Max. Trying to unmute you, Max. There we go. Max.
All right.
Okay. Now, have you in fact discovered the kink in the armor of Citizen Kane? Have you discovered the fallacy in this movie? What do you think about the fact that we never see anyone hear him say that word?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's like everyone is talking about it, yet no one was around him to even hear it. And it's when I realized that, I was like, wait a minute. That kind of throws this whole mystery thing in for a loop, because how can anyone know about it if no one was there to see it? You know, it's like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, did it really happen? But sort of something like that. And when I realized that, I was like, I couldn't help but be like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and you're certainly not the first person to think that. And you know, I don't have an answer to this. I think you can kind of go back and you can sort of convince yourself that that nurse heard it. It's difficult because she is really far away and he is whispering. Maybe you can convince yourself there's somebody else in the room we didn't see. We know that people find out about it. We know that somehow that happens, but there is something
Right.
kind of questionable about the way that scene is shot. And I honestly, I don't have an answer to that. I think it is, I don't know whether it's something, sort of interestingly subversive in the text, or whether it's just kind of a quote unquote a mistake, or the filmmakers had a piece of information that didn't get passed on to us. I don't know. I don't know. You got
Yeah,
anything
but
else to follow up on that?
yeah, I mean, even with that flaw, like that whole theory that Brandon had, like that still, I feel like that still applies. So even realizing that pretty major flaw in the movie, I feel like that still doesn't eliminate the whole various possibilities for what it could mean. So while it is a pretty for because I it is a pretty bad flaw that for the movie to have, considering that it throws the whole mystery under a loop. That still doesn't mean that the movie is bad per se, because we can still speculate what Rosebud means, just like what the reporter does, just
Yeah.
like what everyone else does.
It does require kind of a weird narrative leap of faith in a way. And I'm not sure if that's something that's purposeful. I don't know. And I'll do some research on this. I don't know that anyone involved in the making of the movie has ever commented on this. But let me do a little research on that and see. Maybe I'll have an answer for this next time. Okay, you good, Max? Excuse me.
Yeah.
You good, Max? All right,
Yeah.
let me, let's see. Ethan says he's got something he wants to say. So let's see, make sure I got the right Ethan. Okay. Ethan, you there?
Yep.
You have a thought about Rosebud.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit covered by the quote you said, but I was just thinking about it. Someone said, "Oh, it's like his lost innocence," and I thought, well, his home was like the last place that he actually had someone that he like loved him. Like he had a really good relationship with his mother, and then he was kind of ripped away from that, and in the rest of the movie, other characters like Mary Alexander said like he always was trying to get people to love him, and I think it's because
Leland says the same thing.
yeah,
Yep.
and it's because he was searching for that, because his mother was really the one person that he really loved and that really loved him, and he was kind of ripped away from that. So when he says Rosebud, I at least I thought it kind of, he said that because that was when Rosebud existed in the time when his mom loved him.
Yeah.
He was
Interestingly enough, right? And this may take us back to some of Braden's comments, right? We jump very quickly to that conclusion. It's one of the conclusions, obviously, the movie is dragging us towards. But to play Mary Kane, Charles Foster Kane's mother, Wells casts an actress by the name of Agnes Moorehead. Agnes Moorehead is one of the great sort of unrecognized actors in the history of cinema. Agnes Moorehead was just a phenomenal actress. She had worked with Wells in radio. She was part of his sort of radio ensemble. What Wells had been doing immediately prior to moving to Hollywood to make his first RKO picture, which ended up being Citizen Kane, was both working on Broadway as a director and an actor, working in radio as an actor, and he also had his own weekly radio show. Started off being called First Person Singular, ended up being called the Mercury Theater of the Air. Wells's theatrical company was called the Mercury Theater. His radio company was called the Mercury Theater of the Air. His radio show was called the Mercury Theater of the Air. The production company within RKO Studios that produced Wells's movies was the Mercury Theater. Agnes Moorehead had been working with Wells for a long time. Agnes Moorehead, an incredibly strong actress, a very powerful actress, who basically provides us with a character who does not show any love for that little boy in that scene at all. Now, to Braden's point, is that because we're hearing this story from Thatcher's point of view? Is this because Wells remembers his childhood in a way that it never really existed, right? I mean, even the abusive father seems to care more about the boy than the mother does. So this again, I think, it's a complication. It's a complication. When you realize he's talking about a sled, it propels you immediately back to his childhood. It propels you back to Bernard Herrmann's score that you hear that almost sounds like snow falling, and it propels you back to these sleigh bells in his score. It propels you back to these images of the snow falling and covering up the sled, which is how that sequence ends. It ends with a series of dissolves of the sled laying in the snow and snow covering it. And it forces you to think about the fact that he is missing his childhood. And, you know, it creates all these impressions. But when you go back and look at that scene, some of it's not necessarily happening there. So it may take us again back to the many excellent points Braden made about Wells, Kane, to some extent being the author of his own internal mythology, you know, basically fooling even himself about what his life has been, which is something all of his friends basically say. They all say, you know, you think it's this, but it's not. It's this. You think you're doing this, but you're doing this. You think it's going to be like this, but it's not going to be like that. I think it's another of the strengths of the film that rather than providing us with clear and easy answers, it provides us with circumstances in which there are multiple possible interpretations that we can then talk about and consider. And I think one of the reasons this movie has lasted so long is that we can sit here for a half an hour and talk about a sled. You know, that's you know, where I'm trying to think of a comparable example. I wouldn't even want to sit here and talk a half an hour about the Infinity Stones, but I'll sit here and talk for a half an hour about the sled. Okay, let's see who else we've got coming up here. You have anything to follow up on that, Ethan?
Yeah.
Chase is saying, I had a similar thought with it referring back to the beginning with Rosebud somehow being a symbol of what started it all in his journey through the movie. Let me, Chase, let me.
I'm unmuted already.
Oh, good. Okay. Explain to me what you mean by that. Oh, wait, I think I just muted you. Sorry. Hold on.
Just mute me. I look up and I'm like, you have been muted. What?
No, it's funny. Whenever one person finishes, I just hit mute all. So we're good. So but elaborate on this a little bit for me.
Well, part of it goes back to the childhood thing, but another thing is with a movie making standpoint, it also, like, it's the very beginning of his whole story, and when he begins is that moment right there when the banker comes to take him away. And so I'm wondering if he's reflecting back on his life and he's thinking, this is where this is where it all began. What would have happened if I went down a different path? So I'm wondering if that's what he's thinking about in his dying words.
Well, I think personally, I think yes. I think he's definitely thinking, what would have happened if Thatcher never got his hands on me and I stayed there? You know, if I hadn't been wealthy, I might have really been a great man. It's one of the things he says to Thatcher when he's having to sign over a lot of his holdings to Thatcher during the Great Depression. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it's also worth mentioning, is something you wrote made me think of this, just the functionality of Rosebud. The way in which Rosebud is the hook on which the whole story is hung, right? So rather than if the plan here is to tell a man's life from the bits and pieces, the puzzle pieces of the memories of all of the people who knew him, what is going to be the narrative gimmick, as Wells calls it at one point, that's going to get us from one of these people to another of these people to another of these people, right? So it's not very original, the idea of let's have a reporter trying to find a story, right? But what is the reporter really looking for, right? And what Rosebud does is takes a biography and make it a mystery. And I think that's incredibly important in terms of just keeping us interested, moving us through the story, structuring the story, involving us to some extent in the story. I think just the function part of that is incredibly important as well. Chase, do you want to follow up on any of that?
No, because anything I would have to follow up on was already said by previous people or you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we may have bent this. I'm going to mute everybody real quick. Camden is jumping forward to Stagecoach, and just Camden, don't let me forget about that, okay? I think we'll be able to finish this up pretty soon. Citizen Kane follow a non-linear structure in your opinion? This is from Michael. Yes, and it's not even an opinion. So even the fact that even though the bits and pieces of Kane's life are somewhat in order, we talk to we get the information from Thatcher first, and that's the early part of his life, and we get the information from the butler last, and that's the later part of his life. We're still jumping back and forth. We've still got things, in there like the breakfast table scene, which covers a period of 16 years and overlaps almost every story everyone else is telling. So it is definitely nonlinear. It's our second major nonlinear film for the course after Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And we do have people jumping forward to, well, good. I guess people like Stagecoach. Austin is saying, I believe that it's not about the nurse when Kane says Rosebud. I think it was the last words that his butler and all the people surrounding him heard, so they were just went with that as his final words. So that's interesting, Austin. I never thought of that. What Austin is basically saying is no one heard him whisper Rosebud then, but a lot of people heard him say Rosebud after he tore up Susan's room and was holding the globe. That is an interesting perspective I have never considered. So good for you, Austin. Very, very interesting. Braden's got some more here. Kane, self-mythology, duplicity. He's honest about his duplicity. It's that he's delusional. And it's not that he's delusional license of which in turn causes him to lie to others. It's that he's delusional and lies to himself, which in turn causes him to lie to others. Also, when we actually see Thatcher in the newsreel, he is extremely guarded about Kane. He reads a prepared statement, excellent, and refuses to answer any other questions. Why would we trust what Thatcher says? And Max has come back to say there's even more proof that it suggests a yearning connection back to his childhood for Kane. The snow globe he holds, thank you. Looking inside, we see that it contains a little house surrounded by a field of snow, much like the childhood house. Yes, that's obviously, I think, the thing that reminds him of it. Nate is basically agreeing with me, I think, about although it's to hook the audience through this river twisting around a bunch of unreliable narrators to help us come to our own conclusions. That's nice. And last but not least, Dominique, when they first started looking for Rosebud, I thought it would have more to do with the snow globe than a sled. I thought that it may have a nickname his mom, it may have been a nickname his mom gave him. That's a perfectly reasonable thing. And Rosebud for us, for a big chunk of the movie, is the snow globe. And I think we recognize, if we're paying attention, we see the snow globe in the first scene. We don't really see it clearly as what it is until near the end of the movie. And I think that's the moment at which we're going to draw the connection to his childhood, but we still don't know exactly what Rosebud is, so the mystery still remains. What I'd like to do now, real quick, let me share the screen. Let me just scan through the PowerPoint and see if there's anything else that I feel like I want to make sure we cover, or even just some things maybe to suggest that you go back and look at. So this PowerPoint is of course on D2L. One of the things I'm doing in the PowerPoints now is making it as clear. You should look at all the PowerPoints, And I'm trying to make it as clear as possible when there is a link that is something I expect you to read or expect you to watch. It says very cleverly, read or watch. So hopefully things like that will be clear. I keep trying to go back to the beginning and it takes, okay, all right, here we go. Look at all this work. If, I'm not going to do it this time, but if you are interested in our current president's perspective on Citizen Kane, Charles Foster Kane, and Rosebud, that it is here under one man's perspective. Also, a very amusing video that imagines Orson Welles pitching Citizen Kane to a group of modern studio executives, which I can't recommend highly enough. Okay, we did all this. There's some videos here about Greg Toland. I would recommend that you go back and take a look at those. And this actually is not my newest PowerPoint, so we'll just go through it real quick anyway. A couple of other things that I think would be interesting for you guys. You're seeing the screen now, right? Nod your heads. Yes. Okay. That I think would be interesting for some of you would be to go back and look at the special effects. And there are a couple of videos in here about the special effects. RKO Studios was one of the pioneering studios in the realm of special effects. In as early as 1933, RKO Studios had done the original version of King Kong, which is like every possible special effect up to that time and past it, kind of being comped in there. There is, in fact, and let me see if I can make this a little bigger so you can see it. There is a piece of King Kong in Citizen Kane. And if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, this is a very dark image from when Kane is at Xanadu and he kind of goes out on a picnic and they pitch a bunch of tents out in the Florida Everglades. In the background here, right, this you can see a tent right here. You can see some people. This area back here is actually a back projection inside the studio. So that's a screen with a projector behind it, projecting an image onto it that we can then see from the front. And this footage is actually from King Kong. There is a moment in which you see a bird fly through, and that is actually a pterodactyl. So that is kind of stock footage they have cobbled up from King Kong that you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner. And if you go through these, you can see lots of these images are very elaborate, you know, an art form completely lost to us now of painting on glass. You can see the way in which these images are combined: miniatures, paintings, live action. You can see this wonderful example of a situation in which they could not get the deep focus that they wanted and ended up doing it by shooting Raymond the Butler up here, right, in one piece of film, doing a painting of the hallway here, and then doing another piece of film of Kane in the background so that both Kane and Raymond could be in focus. So that's actually 3 different pieces of film being combined. This particular image, the guys on the stage are the only thing that's really real. Everything else around here, all of these people, except for the first few rows where you can see some movement, that's all a painting as well. There's a, you know, so down here on the stage, you can see that's live action. Getty's in the foreground is live action. Everything in between, again, everything in here is painting. So there's a nice interview with Linwood Dunn, who invented a lot of techniques. You know, I think it's Braden who was really interested in the Thatcher scene. That statue of Thatcher that we start on and then we pan down from is actually also a miniature. And it was a very, very complicated thing in 1940 to try to find out a way to do a combination of panning down, of tilting down from a miniature, and then continuing the tilt down to the live action scene, and tying all that stuff together was really difficult. Also really recommend that you go back and maybe pay a little attention to the sound. I would argue that this may be the first motion picture film in history that actually has conscious sound design. And this is obviously, you know, Wells coming back from his radio work. Let me play this scene real quick and just listen to the way in which the scene, maybe even close your eyes. Listen to the way in which the sound is used as transition, the way the sound is used to suggest space. Of course the media is not found because I've got the wrong, I've opened the wrong PowerPoint. Hold on. I think I may take this time, actually. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to get out of this. Let me see if, before class is over, I can actually open up the correct PowerPoint. Okay. Bear with me, guys.
There's only one man who can rid the politics of this state of the evil domination of boss Jim Geddes.
Hooray!
I am speaking of Charles Foster Kane, the fighting liberal, the friend of the working man, the next governor of this state, who entered upon this campaign with one purpose only.
Let's start that over. Here we go.
There's only one man who can rid the politics of this.
By the way, in the longer clip, we actually start off with Kane sitting in the living room with Susan, and she has played him something on the piano. We hear his hands clapping. So we've got one set of hands clapping that goes to this small crowd of hands
State of the
clapping.
evil domination of boss Jim Geddes.
Hooray!
I am speaking of Charles Foster Kane, the fighting liberal, the friend of the working man, the next governor of this state, who entered upon this campaign with one purpose only: to point out and make public the dishonesty, the downright villainy of boss Jim W. Geddes' political machine.
Now, we haven't seen this space yet, but the sound design itself tells us where he is. I mean, we are hearing the echo. We're hearing how large this space is, right? So we don't even necessarily have to see it to know, but we're going to see it.
Now in complete control of the government of this state, I made no campaign promise.
And that's just, you know, a small example. Something else that you may notice as you, let's see if we got the right one up now, that you may notice as you go along and listen is something else that we also see in the work of John Ford that we're about to talk about, and that is overlapping dialogue. In traditional Hollywood films, actors would finish a line and then start the next one. This made it easier for editing. It's very difficult to edit around people who are talking over top of each other. Wells, again, coming from radio, listening to things that John Ford had done as well. Oh, God. Sorry. Bear with me. I have got to go to work and get the good computer. Cancel. Don't send. Go away. Oh, God. I totally forgot what I was talking about. The overlapping dialogue is something that makes it more difficult. It's more natural. We all do that. We all talk over top of each other. That's why I've got you muted right now. But that's just kidding. But it's something that, you know, until Ford and then Wells really sort of jumped on that bandwagon with both feet. Boy, that is a bad metaphor. We didn't hear that a lot in American films of this particular period. All right, let me see if I can get to where we were. Because the one thing that we have not discussed, that more than anything else, I want to make sure we talk about is what's referred to as the breakfast table scene. You guys are still seeing the screen, right? Okay. So, okay, get back to the previous. Come on. Okay. This is, in the story, a period of 16 years. We see this period of 16 years compressed down into 2 minutes. That would suggest that this is functioning to some extent as a Hollywood montage, as we've discussed before. This is Jed Leland telling the story of Charles Foster Kane's first marriage to, I think, the niece of the President of the United States. Before we even look at the scene again real quick, we see how the scene starts up here in the upper left. We should note the set dressing. We should note the environment. And we should note the way in which things change as we go through. If we just look at, I'm forgetting her name. The actress's name is Ruth Warrick. If we just look at his wife, and we look at the lighting as it changes, we look at the costuming as it changes, we look at the makeup as it changes. We do the same thing with Charles Foster Kane. Compare what Kane looks like in the top picture to what Kane looks like in the bottom. Ruth Warrick in the top, Ruth Warrick in the bottom. If we continue on in the scene, and we see where they are when we get to the end, it's not just performance. It is makeup, it is hair, it is costume, it is environment, it is set dressing, it is props. And we end up on this image down in the bottom right-hand corner, where they are now sitting back in the same room. We've returned to a wider shot. The camera pulls out. My first question to you guys is going to be, do you notice what is different? And I'll go back here in a minute so I can see the comments. What is different in this last image as opposed to what we see in that top image? Let me get back into here so I can see comments. Sorry, everything is so slow today. Anybody want to comment on that, on kind of seeing, which you can't see right now. Okay, I just found out how difficult it is just to have a back and forth conversation. Let me do this. Let's do this instead. Let's make this simpler. Hold on, let me share again. This is worse than the classroom. Okay. Let's just watch the scene one time real quick, and then see if you guys have any comments.
Rosebud? Oh, here's the dying words. Rosebud. Yeah, I saw that in the Enquirer. Well, I never believed anything I saw in.
You guys are seeing the movie, right? One of the things I'll mention to you is this is another example from of so many times we've seen it, of forced perspective. That guy in the background, out of focus, by the way, unusually for this film, in the wheelchair, is actually a miniature. It's a doll in a tiny little wheelchair to suggest that the space is larger than it actually is.
The Enquirer. Anything else? I can tell you about Emily. I went to dancing school with Emily. I was very graceful. We were talking about the first Mrs. Kane.
What was she like?
She's like all the girls I knew in dancing school. Very nice girl, very nice. Emily was a little nicer. Well, after the first couple of months, she and Charlie didn't see much of each other.
By the way, I'll pause this too and just mention, if you get into the PowerPoint and you want to, there's a wonderful interview with the guy who did the makeup for this film, which was also groundbreaking. Wells was wandering through the studio one day and found an assistant makeup person basically sweeping hair off the floor of the makeup and hair room, and started having a conversation with him. And this guy had all of these ideas, things he had never been able to do, because he was basically just considered to be a peon in the studio. And Wells decided to take a chance on him and hired him, and he created all of this groundbreaking aging makeup that we see in Citizen Kane.
Except at breakfast. It was a marriage just like any other marriage.
This, by the way, is the transition that's, it might have been Braden, I can't remember who it was that brought this up last time, where the foreground remains as the background fades out, and then the foreground fades out. So it's kind of a layered dissolve. We haven't talked about Bernard Herrmann, who wrote the score for this. We're going to hear another Bernard Herrmann score later. Bernard Herrmann is one of the most important film composers of the 20th century, possibly even the most important. But also pay attention to the way in which the music is helping to tell this story as well.
You're beautiful.
Oh, I can't.
Yes, you are. You're very, very beautiful.
I've never been to 6 parties in my life.
Extremely
My
beautiful.
whole life. I haven't even been left this
What's
way.
the matter with Cabot?
But we were the servants and things.
I think we enjoyed ourselves.
Yes.
Didn't we?
I don't see why you have to go straight out to the newspaper.
You never should have married a newspaper man. They're worse than sailors. I absolutely adore you.
Oh, Charles, even newspaper men have to sleep.
I'll call Mr. Bernstein, have him put off my appointments until noon. What time is it?
I don't know. It's late.
It's early.
Charles, do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes? What do you do in a newspaper in the middle of the night?
Emily, my dear, your only correspondent is the Inquirer.
Now, usually what I do is I'll stop this moment and I'll say, does anybody know what a correspondent is? But that would take so long to figure out with the chat room. Let me just tell you. So the word correspondent in this particular meaning, when one person would file for divorce against another during this period of time, the third party, the mistress or the person that the woman was having an affair with, more rarely actually in this day and time, would be referred to as the correspondent. So if Emily decided to divorce Charles, one of the things she might do is name someone that he was having an affair with as a correspondent in the legal documents. He is saying the only correspondent is the Inquirer. We know that's not true, because this should be about the time that he meets Susan. So when he says, "Where am I every night? I'm working at the newspaper," that may not be true.
Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
Oh, Emily, I don't spend that much time on the newspaper.
It isn't just the time. It's what you print. Attacking the president.
You mean Uncle John?
I mean the president of the United States.
He's still Uncle John. He's still a well-meaning fathead who's running a pack of high-pressure crooks run his administration. This whole oil scandal.
He happens to be the president, Charles, not you.
That's a
Mistake that will be, again, this is such a wonderful tiny little piece of filmmaking, with the way the lighting is changing, the mood is changing. But also notice even the foreground, the distance between them, even though these shots are very similar, the distance between them is being exaggerated by these larger sort of flower arrangements and things that are being placed in the table between them.
mistake that will be corrected one of these days.
You, Mr. Bernstein, sent Junior the most.
Also, again, what are referred to as swish pans. So these transitional moments where a camera basically pans across something so quickly that everything blurs and suggests kind of a quick movement through time is a device they're using to get us from one time period to another.
Incredible atrocity yesterday, Charles. I simply can't have it in the nursery.
Mr. Bernstein is apt to pay a visit to the nursery now and then.
Does he have to?
Yes.
So Emily doesn't like Mr. Bernstein. We could have a longer conversation about whether we think this has anything to do with anti-Semitism. It's very subtle in the film, if it is, but it's certainly a possibility.
Really, child. People will think.
What I tell them to think.
And of course, the great slap in the face that she's reading the competitor's newspaper. And I think also, although we see, a lot of these characters, made up to be in their 70s, one of the makeup artist's name was Maurice Seidman. I think one of his great accomplishments is the subtlety of the change of makeup as they subtly age during this 12 years in this particular sequence. And of course, as we pull out something many of you have already noticed, it's a different table. It's a bigger table. They're farther apart. They're sitting on the ends of it instead of around the corners of it. And if nothing else, the change of the size of the table suggests what has happened to this marriage over the course of these years. So I think that's a really important piece of kind of cinema history. One of those scenes that everyone talks about all the time. And again, just kind of scanning through this, if it will let me. We talked about special effects. We talked about sound. We talked a little bit about the lighting technique, which is often referred to as Baroque. You can go into here and take a look at that if you want to. We talked a lot about Rosebud. One of the things that you might want to take a look at if you're interested, when Wells first came to RKO, the movie that he wanted to make was an adaptation of a novella by Joseph Conrad called Heart of Darkness. You will almost all be familiar with Heart of Darkness because Heart of Darkness is the novel on which Apocalypse Now is based. Wells was going to tell this story of a character named Marlowe who is on a trip upriver in the Congo to find a mysterious trader by the name of trader by the name of Kurtz, who is kind of quote unquote gone native and has become kind of a god to the natives deep into darkest Africa. You can tell the parallels there with Apocalypse Now. The most interesting thing about this is coming from doing his radio show, First Person Singular, in which all of his stories on radio were told from the first person. He was going to try to tell Heart of Darkness from the first person. This would have been the first film ever told completely from the point of view of a character, where you would never see the character unless they were in the reflection of water or they were in reflected in a mirror. And in fact, there's this very famous image of Wells where he is talking about the I equals I, which was kind of defining how he was going to make this movie. It ended up being above the budget that RKO had agreed to, so they moved on to a couple of other projects, ended up at Citizen Kane. And then, of course, we could go into an enormous history of Orson Welles if we wanted to. I don't see a lot of reason to do that. But if the radio drama aspect of Welles interests you, in the PowerPoint, there are a couple of clips from some of his better radio programs. War of the Worlds, not necessarily being one of his, a great example, but not being a typical example. His adaptation of Treasure Island, his adaptation of Dracula are both pretty spectacular. And then if you want to get some kind of indication, and again, you should go through the PowerPoint. If it says watch, you should watch. If it says read, you should read. That'll give you a little bit more of an indication of Wells's career. Okay, let me get out of the share. Let me see where we are in comments here. Nate, they are physically behind their own newspapers, sitting farther apart, and the shadows have intensified. Absolutely. Braden is talking about seeing some parallels between Kane and Michael Jackson. Yeah. To me, it's a kind of Holden Caulfield-esque dilemma, a character that is desperately trying to hold on to childhood and on to innocence. There's a graduate thesis for you right there. Physically and emotionally drifting apart from Dominique. Ethan saying more distance from one another. Leah is saying it looks like the plants or whatever is in the back are growing much larger as time goes by. You're right, the whole environment just becomes more almost tropical and dense and treacherous. So let me just open it up in the comment section. Is there anything else you guys would like to say about Citizen Kane before we spend the last few minutes of class getting into Stagecoach? All right, let me get rid of this PowerPoint and let me open up another one, which will probably take us until Tuesday. Okay. Let's see. I'm on screen now. Okay. Just a quick introduction as to why I'm doing what we're doing here. So we have an opportunity by doing this double feature, and there's only one more double feature this semester. We have an opportunity to do a couple of things. We have an opportunity to talk very specifically about genre, because we're watching two movies of the same genre from different periods of time, 1939, 1956, if I remember correctly. So we can talk about Westerns, and Westerns being kind of American mythology. We can also talk about the auteur theory a little more detail, because we're watching two movies directed by the same person, again, from two different periods of time in their career. Now, what's, I think, most important to remember as we go forward with Stagecoach and The Searchers is what happens between them. The 20th century is bifurcated by World War II. There is the world as it existed before World War II, and there's the world as it existed after World War II, and they are different worlds. This was a literally world-changing event. It changed people's perspectives. It changed people's view of life, of the world, of art. We can see this occurring. There's a terrific documentary series on Netflix right now called Five Came Back, which is about 5 Hollywood directors. One of them is John Ford. One of them is George Stevens. One of them is William Wyler. One of them is John Huston. And one of them is Frank Capra. These are 5 filmmakers who kind of put their careers aside during World War II to enlist in the war effort and create films for the war. George Stevens, for example, is one of the first people to walk into a Nazi concentration camp with a camera on his shoulder. It changed George Stevens forever. There are movies that George Stevens made before that happened, and there are movies that George Stevens made after that happened, and they are different. In John Ford, we see the same thing. We see that the films John Ford makes before World War II and the films he makes after are different films. So we can look at genre, we can look at auteurism, and we can also look at a couple of films that are both considered to be incredibly important films in the history of cinema. So let me go all the way back here in the comments to see who started talking about. Okay. So Camden has said, when we start talking about Stagecoach, I'd like to get your opinion on one of Doc Boone's last lines they are free from the blessings of civilization. So Camden, let me unmute you.
Hello.
Hi. Let me ask you, what is your opinion about Doc Boone's last line, they are free from the blessings of civilization?
Well, it's established in the very beginning that even though Doc Boone is a drunkard, and they surely show that many, many times, he's very much a thinking man and a philosopher of certain kind. So I always paid close attention to whatever he said, even if it was in a kind of drunken stupor. And one of his last lines, he says that line, and I always thought it was interesting because, in a way, when you first hear it, it sounds kind of contradictory, because it seems like they are in a blessing kind of situation where they can go off and be together. But as I think Dylan pointed out later on in the chat, he kind of had the same mindset as me, where I see it as him being sarcastically saying that to the marshal, saying it in kind of a sense where, unlike everyone else in society and everyone else in the town, who would think that them going off to Mexico would be a horrible idea, they're actually being free from the confines and the societal restrictions that are put upon their certain kind of livelihood and their lifestyle. So I just thought that was a really interesting line, calling it that they're free from a blessing. In reality, what he's really saying is that they're not a blessing at all.
Yeah. So I'm pulling something up for me to look at. You guys won't be able to see it, but it won't really matter. If we back up just a minute and we think about the Western genre, and you know, the Western genre through the history of cinema, you know, one of the earliest narrative films was a Western, The Great Train Robbery. So the history of Westerns, history of cinema, they're all kind of tied in together. One of the things I mentioned in the PowerPoint that I'll be giving you guys, I haven't put it up yet because it's not quite finished, should be finished today, that Western films often deal with three sometimes complementary and then sometimes contradictory themes. One of those themes is the passing of a way of life and the yearning for a simpler time. Let's put that aside for a minute. Another is the importance and the power of the individual and of an individual code of conduct. In other words, morality, righteousness, honor, justice. Put that aside for a minute. One of the key things that Westerns are doing, though, is talking about the conflict between civilization and wilderness. The whole story of Westerns is the idea of a bunch of white people coming over from Europe and pushing their way across a continent, pushing everything that is not civilized out of their way, whether that be the environment, whether that be the natives who live there, and bringing to this wilderness community, order, law, selflessness. Whereas wilderness is kind of thought to be chaos, it's thought to be nature, it's thought to be savagery, it's thought to be selfishness. But the most interesting Westerns deal with the idea that it's not necessarily a good versus bad thing, that there are issues with civilization as there are issues with the wilderness, and that neither are perfect.
Also,
yeah, go ahead.
Also mentioned that I noticed by the end too that when you have the resolution and you see the result of and the conclusion to every single person's story at the end, all the people that were in that stagecoach, you realize that the people that were deemed respectable in their society were actually the ones that were the most morally unjust, and the ones that were seen in society, whether it be the Doc who was seen as a drunkard, or Dallas who was a prostitute, or of course John Wayne as a rugged, unruly kind of criminal.
Criminal, yeah.
You see that they're actually the ones that are more morally righteous comparatively to, say, the banker who was a embezzler, and others as well.
Right. So, you know, if we drill into that last scene and we think about, okay, the people who are leaving, who are being spared civilization, are Ringo and Dallas. When we meet Dallas, she is being ushered, she's being kicked out of town. She is not morally acceptable to the sort of group of women in this town who are the arbiters of what is morally acceptable. And she and Doc Boone are both kind of being ridden out of town on a rail. Him for being a drunkard, her for being morally corrupt. It's obvious from those scenes that our sympathies are meant to lie with Doc Boone and Dallas, and that this thing that comes with civilization, which is intolerance, is something that the filmmakers are not they don't like. That's part of civilization that is harmful. So at the end of the movie, and then also when we meet the Ringo Kid, he's a criminal. You see people looking down upon him in that Stagecoach. He's naive. He's innocent. He doesn't even get that she's a prostitute. That doesn't even register for him. He can't even think about a way to treat her any differently than he would treat any other woman. So it's those two people who are allowed to escape civilization at the end. Civilization for the Ringo Kid meaning jail, right? And I think it's also interesting that we end up at that end of the movie with a character who is a representative of law and order, the sheriff himself, who's going to be the one that says, this part of civilization we're setting aside. I have my own code, and my own code is more important than the laws of the land. And that code tells me that these people deserve a chance and they should be allowed to go. Also, remember that we're in 1939. We are only... The United States and the world, in fact, is not even completely out of the Great Depression yet. We're certainly past the worst of it, but we're still in the Great Depression. It's not surprising, for example, that a banker is going to be the villain of this piece, right? And everything that the bank that represents in terms of civilization is going to be something that is villainized in this movie. That's going to make sense to a 1939 audience. So even though sometimes we can look at more simplistic Westerns as civilization good, wilderness bad, the sheriff good, the outlaws bad, the cavalry good, the Indians bad. The most interesting Westerns are the ones that mix that up and make that more complex, which is something Ford was always more interested in doing. And you're right, Camden has come in, I'm sorry, you're Camden. Dylan has come in to say, Camden, in regards to Stagecoach, I truly believe he's referring sarcastically to American civilization and the way it viewed and would have continued to view Ringo and Dallas due to its moral standards or condemnation, and the fact that when they leave, they are free of the blessings that come with being away from such a society, especially considering that in the time that the film is set, many saw the area across the border in a poor light. Less so than today. During this period of time, in fact, Mexico would have been considered rather exotic and an interesting environment.
Yeah, there was kind of a romanticism to it, right?
Yes, absolutely. We do still have the sort of the stereotypes of the Mexican bandit that you see in movies. 10 years later, we have something like Treasure of Sierra Madre with Humphrey Bogart, where we have the famous "I don't need no stinking badge," kind of stereotype Mexican bandit. But just as often, we would see Mexico appear in musicals where it was just this amazing sort of fantasy world of people dancing and. Okay, so that was Dylan. Now I'm back. Hold it back into Citizen Kane. Okay, hold on. Let me get. Where are we?
And before I
go ahead, please.
Unmute me. I have one little thing I'd like to mention is that when I loved the editing in the film. I thought that it was very tightly edited, and I thought all of the scenes were very evenly paced and very nicely done. But there's one tiny nitpick that I have, is that when you first are introduced to John Wayne, to Ringo, and you just hear that gunshot, and then you cut over and you get that great zoom in on him as he's holding the gun.
Yeah.
I thought that it could have been cut a little bit better. Because there's a moment, you see a wider shot of the Stagecoach going down a trail, and then you hear the gunshot, and then I think you you cut to maybe inside the stagecoach. I can't remember if that was what happened, and then you get to see John Wayne. And I just thought that it would have been nicer and a little bit more of a smack to the audience, like a little bit more of a shock, if you had just had the gunshot and then directly cut to John Wayne's character. I don't know why. It just really kind of it irked me a little bit whenever I saw that.
Is it the dolly that is the problem? Or you'd rather it be a direct cut, or is it?
No. I love the dolly, and whenever it was going into John Wayne's character and becoming a closer shot. The sequence of shots before the hand.
I'll tell you what. Let's look at it. Hold on. I'm gonna share the screen. We're almost out of time, I'm noticing, so this will be the last thing we do. But let's take a look at this scene real quick.
Yeah, that shot. Mm-hmm.
That is interesting. I'd never noticed that before. So that is a bit of you hear the gunshot, and then it cuts away to the cavalry.
Yeah, and then you hear that kind of poorly placed water noises that don't really feel too much like they're there.
I'm not 100% sure why that's there either. Let's watch the rest of the scene.
See? Yeah.
Hey, look, it's Ringo. Yeah. Hello, kid. Hello, Curly. Hiya, Buck. How's your folks? Oh, just fine, Ringo, except my grandfather came out. Didn't expect to see you riding shotgun on this run, Marshal. On Lordsburg? I figured you'd be there by this time. Well, same horse.
There's a couple of interesting things going on there.
Yeah,
and honestly, now that you pointed out this shot of the cavalry, and I'm trying to remember in terms of the story at this point, is the cavalry coming to meet them?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just that weird 2-second shot of that happening that just kind of stopped the energy that was going on.
I have to kind of agree. I'm not sure I understand why that's there. I will say the other thing that may sort of stump modern audiences a bit is that this particular shot, which, by the way, is possibly, one of the most important shots in cinema history. This is the introduction to the world as an A-list major movie star of someone who is possibly the biggest movie star of all time. And that is John Wayne. Now, we're not going to gloss over the problems that we have with John Wayne, and we'll talk about what those are. But this is a mythic sort of introduction. This camera move in, he's shot in a studio against a back projection of Monument Valley, which really doesn't quite match the reverse shot, but it is establishing Monument Valley, this very iconic location, this incredibly iconic character, this incredibly influential actor, all being sort of introduced in this one particular moment. This one shot is incredibly important. I will agree with you, though, there's a little bit of weird editing in there that I'm not sure I understand. It's not going to let me enjoy the movie any less, but I'm with you. I'm not 100% sure I get it.
Yeah, I love the shot and the dolly, of course. I just thought it could have been put together almost right after the gunshot is heard and you see the stagecoach.
Yeah, I don't know, and I'll have to look at the longer scene or the film again. I have no idea why. Well, this is something else. I'll end it with this. I have no idea in that scene why the cavalry is there or where they're coming from, and here's the reason. Orson Welles, and I know we're over time, guys, but those who can stay with me will hear this story. If you need to leave, I understand. Orson Welles always claimed that in order to learn how to make a movie, he was making his first movie with Citizen Kane. He went to the RKO screening room and he watched Stagecoach 40 times. That this is how he learned movie making. 1 or 2 days into filming, Wells was telling his cinematographer, Greg Toland, that he wanted the camera put here. And Greg Toland said to him, we probably shouldn't put the camera there. That is crossing the line. And Wells went, what do you mean crossing the line? And this is, of course, the 180-degree rule, the idea that there's, you decide which side of a conversation or an action you're going to shoot from, and your camera's always on that side, and therefore your screen direction is always consistent. And Greg Toland tried to explain this to Wells, and Wells just glossed over. And he tried to explain it again. This famously, by the way, Greg Toland had taught Wells almost everything that needed to be learned about filmmaking in a day. He said, I can teach you everything you need to know in a day, and they did it. This he couldn't get. Wells could not understand it. They literally shut down production. Wells went home, sat in a dark room for several hours, and then finally kind of figured out what this meant. Now, one of the things we suspect is that John Ford pretty much ignored the 180-degree rule, as a lot of filmmakers did in this period of time. So I'm looking at that scene, and I'm seeing the stagecoach, which is essentially going from right to left. And then I'm looking at the cavalry in this weird shot, and they're going from right to left. And I have no idea where they are in space. If they were going from left to right, I would understand they are coming to meet the stagecoach. Coming from left to right makes me think they're behind them. I don't think they are. And I think that screen direction thing also makes that edit a little awkward. But it also, leads into that wonderful Wells story, which I like so much. Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do, guys. We will just pick up with this and then move on into, we're going to be a little bit behind, from now on, but that's life. We'll maybe catch up at some point. We'll get into the Searchers, so be sure you've seen the Searchers by next Tuesday, and we'll start to compare those. Anybody got any, I'm going to unmute everybody. Anybody got any last questions or issues you want to talk about?
Nope.
One thing I'll mention, I'll send an email about this out, but since you guys are there, I have finally figured out how to put images in the quizzes on D2L, so you will no longer have to go back and look at image documents. So you won't have to worry about that anymore. All right, I guess that's it for today then. Thank you, everybody. Stay well, stay safe. Don't touch your face as much as I do.
You have a good one.
You too.
See ya.
All right, unless anybody needs anything, I'm cutting out.